So good afternoon, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? So I want to, first of all, thank you for coming here to make this event, my first in-person event since February of 2020, possible. I want to thank a number of people, and I'm going to forget some others as well, but I want to thank Eli Rastum, Amanda Nepomuceno, Hosta Coleman, Lo Shuxian, and the excellent SAIS events team headed by Gabrielle, who was in the booth, for all their hard work. The format will be that Ryan Haas, our speaker, will provide some initial comments, then we'll engage in a discussion of the book, Stronger, which I will come back to in just a moment, and some of the key insights that he provides and questions that the book raises. And then we'll extend the discussion to the audience for Q&A. It's going to be kind of a discussion, more of a discussion, less of a formal presentation. So I hope that everybody has lots of questions, and we will do our best to accommodate all of you. When asking questions, please identify who you are so that we know who you are. And because I know that many of you are keen to join the discussion, please keep your questions to the point as much as possible. Ryan Haas has the type of professional background that many of us aspire to. He's a senior fellow and Michael H. Armacost chair in the foreign policy program at Brookings, where he holds a joint appointment to the John L. Thornton China Center and the Center for East Asia Policy Studies. He is also the Chen Fu and Cecilia Yen Ku Chair in Taiwan Studies and was part of the inaugural class of David Rubenstein Fellows at Brookings. He also leads the Democracy in Asia project at the Brookings Institution and serves as a non-resident affiliated fellow in the Paul Tsai China Center at Yale Law School. From 2013 to 2017, he served as Director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia at the National Security Council at the White House and coordinated the implementation of U.S. policy toward the region. Prior to joining the NSC, he served as a Foreign Service Officer in the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, where he earned the State Department Director General's Award for Impact and Originality in Reporting. He's also served in the embassy the U.S. Embassy at Seoul and in Ulaanbaatar, and domestically in the State Department Office of Taiwan Coordination and Korean Affairs. He's received multiple superior honor and meritorious honor commendations during his 15-year tenure in the Foreign Service. He is the author of Stronger, Adapting America's China Strategy in an Age of Competitive Interdependence, and a co-editor of Global China, Assessing China's Growing Role in the World, and of the monograph, The Future of U.S. Policy Towards China, Recommendations for the Biden Administration. He graduated from the University of Washington, and I would be remiss not to underscore that he attended the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies prior to joining the State Department. The book that I just mentioned, Stronger, Adapting China's Strategy in an Age of Competitive Interdependence, a term that he coined, is, and I'm at the risk of using an overused phrase, but one that I think is absolutely on point here, a must-read. Drawing from his extensive work in the service of managing U.S.-China relations, it is full of important insights, corrective assumptions, and warnings against pursuing policies that hurt U.S. interests, even as they provide short-term satisfaction or cheap political points, although he says so much more elegantly than I just have in the in the book. It provides a nuanced and important roadmap in pursuing this vital relationship in today's global environment and into the future. It is, in short, a call for all of us to eat our vegetables and believe in our strengths that we are all better off when we play to them, jointly managing issues where we can and must, and recognizing where we need to agree to disagree. Importantly, it also recognizes the importance that this relationship has on our allies and partners, and vice versa, that these two sets of policy goals are deeply intertwined. These are not easy lessons to hear or prescriptions to undertake. They require confidence and trust at a time when they are often displayed by fear and projection. but it should be required reading for everybody, no matter how peripheral they may be to the relationship, and it provides a sorely needed a corrective to the dominant narrative that China is here to eat our lunch, and, to mix metaphors, that our best course of action is to circle our wagons. It is, in short, an important, even vital book. My colleague Ann Thurston, who can't be here today, just emailed me earlier this morning that she regards the book as, quote, really excellent, so accessible and easy to read, perfect in tone, very well researched, as well as drawing on his own personal experiences. If I had one book to recommend on US-China relations for the interested public, it would be his. I absolutely concur. Ryan, welcome, and thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today.
Well, that's about the nicest introduction I've ever had. I really appreciate it. I do want to start out by just blurring the picture a little bit by telling you a little bit about who I am beyond the very nice titles that Professor Mertha was kind enough to share with you. I grew up in Bellingham, Washington, in the northwest corner of the United States. I grew up with farmers and fishermen. It was a sort of a rough and tumble place. Went to the University of Washington, came to SAIS straight out of undergraduate, and then from there into the Foreign Service. I had a chance to marry my college sweetheart. We have 4 kids, and we spend a lot of our time chasing after them these days. But my time at SAIS was really valuable. I loved what I learned here, but even more so the friendships that I was able to build. And those are friendships that have sort of nurtured and fortified me throughout my entire career. I'm still in touch with people from SAIS on a weekly basis. So I say all this with a degree of envy for you and the experience that you all are going through. I also wanted to acknowledge the great help of Kevin Dong, another SAIS alumni who all credit for research for the book goes to him. He was a tremendous partner throughout this exercise. My goal today is to have a genuine conversation with you all. But to kick off and spark the conversation, I just wanted to put a few quick ideas on the table. The story that I'm going to tell starts at Trump Tower in December 2016. President-elect Trump had just won the election, and I was working at the White House National Security Council at the time as the China director. I was dispatched by President Obama to go up to Trump Tower to share with the incoming team the logic of the approach that we had taken towards China and what they would be inheriting on January 20th. The goal was not to put any spin on the ball or persuade them of anything, just to help them understand the nature of the relationship that they would be walking into. We got about 5 minutes into the conversation, and the person on the other side of the table put his hand up and said, "Enough, I've heard enough. I know what I need to know. We're good." And I said, "Oh, well, okay, well, that's great." And that was it. They knew what they needed to know, and they had a plan to translate the attitude that President Trump had sold into an approach. And at its very essence, the approach was to sell the idea that China was on an inexorable rise, that China's rise was a threat to America and America's place in the world, and then unless China was stopped, China's rise would threaten the vision and the values that the United States had sought to advance. This effort to reimagine America's approach to China got an unlikely assist shortly thereafter. 2 former alumni of the Obama administration wrote an article talking about how the past 40 years of American policy toward China had been a failure, and that a new approach was needed. So in a short period of time, we shifted approach and were able to do so in a way that could credibly be argued as reflecting a new bipartisan consensus. This new approach was intended to be tough. It was intended to block China's progress, to blunt China's actions, to deny China legitimacy, and really to essentially counter China everywhere that they were taking actions. The approach was resistant to diplomacy. Engagement was seen as a form of appeasement. Compromise was viewed as a concession. And this is a problem, because if compromise becomes viewed as concession and appeasement, then the only option you have left is to magnify the threat and vilify the other. Because in diplomacy, the only time that you get everything that you want is in conditions of absolute surrender. And there have only been a few of them in recent history, most recent being at the end of World War II. I was concerned, as I was watching all this unfold, that we were misdiagnosing the moment and that we were pointing ourselves in a direction that would do harm to us. It would lead us to be reactive, to be anxious, to be defensive, and to be undisciplined in trying to challenge China everywhere at all times. And I thought we should have confidence. We have reason to have confidence in ourselves and our ability to compete with China, and that confidence is important. Confidence is the wellspring of steadiness, of patience, of farsightedness, and we are still the stronger power in the U.S.-China relationship. We have benign borders, the world's reserve currency, higher education system that's the envy of the world, liquid, deep capital markets, a culture that attracts the best and the brightest minds to want to live and work here, a transparent legal system, a resilient political system. These are real attributes. We enjoy these, others do not. But exaggerating China's strengths and overlooking their weaknesses also creates problems for us, I think. It causes us to appear insecure. And insecurity is no more attractive in countries than it is in individuals. It's not a strong basis on which to attract others to stand by our side. It validates China's narrative that we are a anxious, declining power doing everything that we can to try to cling to our privileged position. It doesn't give us a solid basis to build coalitions with allies and partners around the world, because great power competition is exciting in Washington. It travels less well, in my experience, to capitals in Europe and Asia and elsewhere. But even aside from all those things, I just worry that anxiety creates insecurity. Insecurity produces overreaction, and overreaction often is the basis of bad policy. So part of the work that I wanted to try to do through this book is to right-size the challenge that China presents to us. Because China is, I do believe, our most formidable challenger, and it will be for a long time. But China is not traveling on a linear path towards global domination. It's also not on the precipice of collapse. I see it more so as an enduring but somewhat constrained competitor. And China already is confronting some pretty significant headwinds. It's an incredibly hard governance challenge. They have mounting debt, bad demographics, trouble creating productivity gains, capital is not being allocated very efficiently in their economy, GDP growth is slowing, and none of these challenges are going to get easier anytime soon. But the second thing I wanted the book to try to do was to try to clarify what exactly it is that we're competing over. There's not a lot of dispute that the United States and China are in an intense competition, but there's rarely a discussion about what exactly we're competing about. And in my view, the competition is over which country's governance system is best able to meet the challenges of the 21st century. We both think that we are best positioned to meet those challenges. We both have a lot of confidence in our own systems. And we both recognize that whichever governance system produces the best results will enjoy the pull of power in the international system. We both want to outpace the other in this long-term competition. And that's, in its essence, I think, what the United States and China are competing about. But we need to go a step further, too. We also need to understand the nature of the relationship that exists between the United States and China. It's often talked about as a highly competitive relationship or an intense competition, an extreme competition, a lot of adjectives that get attached to competition. And it is true. It is a competitive relationship. We do have different governance systems. We do have different views on fundamental issues like the role of the individual versus social stability, the role of the state in the economy, different regional and global ambitions, differences of views over Taiwan and other issues like Xinjiang. But to only see competition and ignore interdependence, I think, misses a key element of the broader picture of the relationship. Because the reality is that the United States and China have thick interdependence on a whole range of issues. Our economies are deeply integrated with each other. There's deep knowledge production that takes place between the west coast of the United States and the east coast of China. Our students go back and forth. There are thick social networks and bonds between both countries. There's also ecological interdependence that neither country can escape. We're both stuck on the same planet. We're both affected by the same climate change. We're both affected by the same pandemics. And so whether we like each other or not is indifferent to the fact that we will be affected for good or ill by the actions of each other. It also is just a simple fact that neither country is really going to be capable of imposing its will on the other at acceptable cost or risk. So, if you accept this diagnosis, then the question is, what is it that the United States should do to deal with this challenge? And the proposition that I put forward to you, and I look forward to discussing with you, is that we'll do best in this competition by nurturing our own sources of strength, rather than being frustrated by our inability to degrade China's. Our key advantages are our alliance network, our domestic dynamism, our global prestige that derives from our unique ability to galvanize global efforts to tackle global challenges. We control these advantages. No one else does. No one can take them away from us. But ultimately, we're not going anywhere. China's not going anywhere. We're not going to be able to impose our views on China any more than we've been able to impose them on Cuba or Venezuela or Iraq or Afghanistan or Libya or Syria. We're going to be in a competitive coexistence with China for a long time to come. We don't need to defeat China. We don't need to destroy China. We need to live up to our own potential. If we play to our strengths, I'm confident we'll be able to do just fine in our ability to compete with China. But with that, I hope I've put enough on the table to get our conversation started. I'm really looking forward to the interaction that we'll have.
I was busy scribbling notes, so you caught me mid-sentence. You've put an awful lot on the plate, and so maybe what I'd like to do is just start with, and I have to confess to all of you that I was really hoping that I could be more critical of the book than I can be, and so I thought that one of the things that I would do is maybe tease out some of the things that I thought were really particularly noteworthy, and that's also a difficult task, just given how rich the analysis is. But I guess the first question what I would have is, how do we define competitive interdependence, and how is that different from, say, Cohen and Nye's notion of complex interdependence, as well as what you were mentioning as thick interdependence, which is more of a kind of a secular term that I would make a lot of sense for me, just kind of seeing how things work out on the ground. So, could you just tease that out a little bit conceptually for those who may not have read the book?
Yeah. So thank you. I think the idea of competitive interdependence is that these are two dynamics that are a bit in tension with each other, but can't be disentangled from each other. That there is going to be competition, but that competition will be naturally bounded by the fact that we have this deep interdependence, or whatever type of interdependence you want to describe. And so, as a consequence, we can take swings at China, but we will hurt ourselves in the process of doing so, and the same in reverse. China can do harm to us, but it's very difficult for China to do harm to us without hurting itself in the process, as a function of the fact that we were both so integrated or interdependent with each other. And in the past, I think that, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but I think that there was a view that interdependence on its own would create stability in the relationship, that it would just make things too costly for things to turn into confrontation. I think that view has faded a bit as time has gone by. Interdependence has increasingly become viewed as a vulnerability to the United States because it limits our ability to punch the Chinese when we want to, and vice versa. So my expectation as we sort of project forward is that there will continue to be deep interdependence. It's just hard to disentangle ourselves from each other. But it won't necessarily be viewed as an unallied good or force for stability. So there will be areas of vulnerability where we will try to become less interdependent around high technology, dual-use technologies. But even as we do that, fundamentally, the overall relationship will remain highly interdependent.
So that brings up a number of things that I'd love to kind of just explore. Maybe I'll throw them out together, and you can take whatever in whatever order or whatever to choose to focus on the ones that you find most relevant. So one of the things about interdependence, it's, as you say, one can see the arguments about that making us somewhat more vulnerable, or making people or states involved in complex interdependence more vulnerable. On the other hand, it has a huge benefit of mitigating worst-case outcomes because you have this sense of standard operating procedures, of rhythms, of kind of interacting with people over time, that even while it may not be a representative of a state that's an ally of the U.S., nonetheless, you understand how one another operates, and that over time, that thickness becomes really, really important. So I guess part of it might be that why are those fail-safes seen as less valuable than the desire to punch China, is desirable?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to think about this question. I don't know if I have a great answer to it, but one of the elements that makes interdependence so important is it's a differentiating factor from where we were with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, right? That we did not have interdependence with the Soviet Union. We had mutual vulnerability with the Soviet Union, but we didn't have interdependence. And I think it's important for us to keep that sort of front of mind, because containment and some of the other tools that were used during the Cold War just are not available options to us now. When over 100 countries in the world identify China as their top trading partner, I'm not sure who it is that we would expect to contain China alongside us. And one country's containment of another isn't exactly a containment strategy, right? So I think that it has a limiting effect to a certain extent, which is important for us to keep in mind. But I also think that it forces senior officials in both countries to recognize that it's not really realistic or serious to view the relationship entirely in zero-sum terms, where one country's gain is another country's loss. Because when we have these types of interdependencies, the reality is that there are certain issues that are zero-sum, but there also are a lot of issues that are either positive or negative-sum, in the sense that we will both either benefit together or be harmed together, depending upon how we approach these issues. And we're seeing a real live experiment of this right now with the pandemic response, with climate issues, with energy security issues. Both the United States and China are being sort of buffeted by these trends simultaneously. Not because we both want to experience them together or sort of have this shared pain together, but just as a function of the deep interdependence that we both share.
That leads exactly to what I wanted to ask about this. We're taught there's less now than there was, say, a year ago, but it's still very much in the ether, this idea of decoupling. And I think I had a conversation with some Chinese counterparts / colleagues about the issue of competition, the way they saw competition. And it was something that they felt uncomfortable with because the way they saw it, the more you make things independent from one another, kind of you're going against the kind of the logic of linkages, which is kind of what what was kind of the blueprint of the relationship in the first place, but also thinking like a game theorist, using backwards induction from, well, if this is the end game that we're looking for, then that pretty much then constrains all the way back to the present day. Whereas if you keep things ambiguous, or you keep this shadow of the future, to use the term of art, but we're not really. From what you hear a lot from the narrative here, it kind of sounds like that, but that's not at all the way the underlying logic is.
Yeah.
Could I?
Yeah. So I think that what I hear from Chinese friends is that they really don't like the formulation that the Biden administration used of 3 C's: cooperate, compete, and confront, with a heavy emphasis on the latter 2 C's. They would prefer to have CCM, cooperate, compete, and manage, not confront, but manage areas where we have differences. And I think that this is sort of a modest, concession to the point that you were making, that they recognize that there will be just sort of areas of tension in the relationship where we'll have fundamental differences of views. But they don't want it to be cast as confrontational or highly competitive. They want these things to be managed. And it's not a unreasonable expectation or ask from my perspective. Part of what I was hoping through this book to argue, and I'm really glad that you've drawn this out, is that we don't need to win or lose against China. Not everything in the world is zero sum. And what I think we're really competing over is just to demonstrate who has the best answers to the problems that we will all confront in the period of time. And if we can elongate the time horizon in which we're having these discussions, so it's not a existential near-term crisis where we need to dominate and prevail, but a long-term competition. I think that allows us a little bit more mental space to think through some of these challenges. But I also think it sort of opens up space for let the best system prevail. If we really do believe that we have, that liberal democratic systems have the best answers for the societal challenges that we confront, then we should stand by that and believe it and trust that over time that the cream will rise to the top and that we will be able to deliver solutions. I think the Chinese believe that their system has performed well in recent decades and that it will continue to going forward. That doesn't bother me. In fact, I think it's good for the overall relationship because as I think back on the relationship works best when both countries have confidence in themselves and their future. It's most turbulent when one or both parties feel vulnerable or threatened or insecure. That's when things get rockiest. And so if we can both perform well and both have confidence in our own systems in the future, then there will be a lot more space, I think, for each country to develop along its own path.
So on precisely that point, you had said that we should play to our own strengths, and I agree with that. And I think I'm also hearing that China should play to theirs. And I guess my question would be, first of all, what are their strengths? That they should play to. But another part of that question is why. I always thought that one of the reasons why. Or one of the contradictions, just to use a Maoist term, is that when we first started to broach the relationship with China 50 years ago, early next year, China was much weaker than we thought it was. And now that China is so much stronger than it was then, or than it was even, say, 15 years ago. I mean, by an order of magnitude. Why does this? There seems to be this notion that we have to demonstrate, we have to tell everybody what we are instead of just showing what they are. And it seems to me that once that, I don't want to sound simplistic, but jettisoning that, I think would be a huge part of demonstrating real self-confidence, which I think China, just my own view, is that China is more than earned.
Yeah.
I'd just love to hear your comments on that.
I think that's right. I started out by talking about where I grew up so that we could get to this point. Where I grew up with farmers and fishermen, if you ever walked into a room and said, you know what, I'm really strong, I'm entering this conversation from a position of strength, you'd either be laughed at or punched, or maybe both. Because if you're strong, you don't tell people you're strong, you just act strong. And that's why every time I hear U.S. government officials talk about entering the negotiations or entering the dialogue from a position of strength, I just cringe. Let's act strong. Let's have confidence in ourselves. And we have ample reason to do so. I think the Chinese do too. And that's fine. The Chinese should have confidence. They've had a very productive run over the past 40 years. Both of our governance systems have their own strengths and shortcomings. But I wrote my book for an American audience. I'm a former American official, so I spent my time concentrating on the American side of the ledger, and we'll leave it to Chinese colleagues to do the same on their own.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Before I move back from China, to our side of the equation, you write that China represents the hardest governance challenge on the planet, and I'm assuming you mean that in terms of China governing China. And I just want to make a comment first of all that is a sentiment that I try to weave into every sentence in every lesson and because it's something that is as self-evident to me, or I think anybody who's spent considerable time in China, yet it does not seem to have the kind of traction with the way in which China is viewed and discussed and debated and here. And I wonder if we're not even thinking that the things that we might ascribe to what are the things that keep China's leaders awake at night are maybe 10, 11, 12 on the, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff that we're not even thinking about that are the things that they are really, really nervous about. And how might we, what can we do, as students of the relationship, but also eventually practitioners, within that web? What can we do to inform people, or why do you think there's this resistance or this lack of traction to that really important way of thinking about China?
Well, the first thing we can do is take careful note of Professor Mertha's observation about the challenges that China confronts. It gives me a lot more confidence in making this point, knowing that you make it as well. I always sort of thought back to when I was in government, and we would often ask people who would travel to the White House to brief us, what is it that keeps Xi Jinping up at night? And the consistent thing that I heard was, well, 48 out of the 50 things that may keep him up at night are domestic. And that always kept things in perspective for me, because the reality is that the scale of the challenges that China's leaders confront are just absolutely enormous. And I'm not suggesting that they're insurmountable or impossible to manage, because they have managed them, but they're just extraordinarily complex. And they involve trade-offs that I think are going to become sharper for the Chinese leadership as we move forward. They can no longer, I don't think, treat water or air as expendable resources. That bill is coming due. They can no longer, manage a one China policy. That bill is coming due. They can no longer buy growth through state-directed investment. The cost of doing so are just becoming higher and higher. And I don't say this to, create some doom and gloom scenario of imminent collapse. I don't think that's in the cards. Just that we should probably put ourselves in their shoes a little bit more as we think about this relationship, rather than sort of abiding by this caricatured view that we read in the press every day about how China is 10 feet tall and they can jump mountains and predict the future. Any of us who have lived there or worked in a very intensive way with our Chinese counterparts, I think, know that's not the case. I have tremendous respect for my Chinese counterparts, but I don't enter a room intimidated by them, and I don't think that American officials should either.
I think that's a great point to keep in mind. So let me move away from China and kind of broaden it beyond just the U.S. In Chapter 2, and then you touch upon this throughout, you make a compelling case for thinking about the bilateral relationship, but in multilateral terms. You make an impassioned case for understanding how important it is to nurture our alliances, even as we might be unable to get them to do what we'd really like them to do. Can I ask you to just go into a little bit more depth as to why this is so important?
Sure.
Especially now, kind of post-Trump administration multilateral policy.
I think that the United States and China are in a competition to see who can attract more high-quality friends. Because the reality is that a lot of the challenges that we both confront, we alone are not capable of dealing with, and they alone are not capable of dealing with. So hopefully over time we will find commonality of purpose on some of these issues, but not all of them. And we are in a stronger position to deal with some of the challenges that China poses to us if we are working in lockstep with allies and partners to do so. I always have found that the Chinese leadership takes most careful note of our concerns when we're able to raise our concerns both privately and publicly through bilateral channels, and also in a chorus effect with allies and partners. If any of those elements of the four quadrants are missing, I think that the strength of our concern is discounted in their minds. And so it's important when we really feel seriously about something that we are able to hit all four of those quadrants. But I also just sort of fundamentally believe that no country or no individual action is going to change the course of Chinese policy. It really requires them to hear it in a coordinated fashion, in a strong fashion, from as many angles as possible for them to take it seriously. And so if we do have concerns about, pick your issue, subsidies, intellectual property protection, we can talk about it all we want. We can raise it in as many meetings as we want, but if we do it alone, I think that the effect of our concerns is going to be greatly diminished. And so the question that leads us to is, how do we build that coalitional effect for dealing with China? And my view is that we start small and build. We don't need to impose our threat diagnosis of China onto other countries, because every country has their own unique relationship with China. The view from Berlin is different than the view from Washington. The view from Seoul is different than the view from Washington. So we need to meet our friends where they are rather than insisting that they come meet us where we are, and find those areas where our concerns overlap and we both have comfort in addressing them together. And I think that if we do that, we can gain momentum and over time put ourselves in a stronger position to have this long-term competition with China.
Just to drill down a little bit, because I remember when my formative years as a student of China was in the 1990s, and my doctoral dissertation was on intellectual property. So I was very much kind of in the crosshairs, or I was adjacent to the crosshairs of that issue, and it was one of the problems then was getting our allies on board with us, because insofar as there was a gap between the U.S. and China, it was one that they were eager to fill. I'm simplifying that, but that was a dominant dynamic at the time. Is that dynamic still around, or has it been mitigated or recalibrated, just given the complexities that we're in today?
I think that dynamic still exists, but maybe in a lessened form than it was in the 90s, simply because China is no longer a low-end manufacturer, right? They are competing directly with us and other developed economies. They're navigating the innovation frontier alongside us in a growing number of fields. And so the scale of the challenge and the directness of the challenge that they pose is being felt more acutely and more directly by more countries than perhaps it was in the 1990s. But I also think that the fact that China's relationships with many countries in the developed world is increasingly being strained creates more fertile ground for us to begin to explore the possibility of cooperating on some of these issues. I think that there's more space for creative thinking, and I think that there's more tolerance by publics for working alongside us on these issues if we can find ways to do it artfully.
With the exception of Cambodia, which you note in the book.
Yeah, right.
So I wanted to, there's another question that I had. We were talking about demonstrating strength, and demonstrating self-confidence, but also it's a question of perception. And I think about when kind of the initial Obama administration overtures to China. This is pre-Xi, but this idea of let's work together kind of in more of a kind of a partnership capacity, more akin to being equals, in responsibility, if not quite in power. And many people I've talked to said that China misread that as sort of as a kind of a demonstration of weakness, and so they, I think, badly miscalculated, and that led things off to on the wrong foot. But specifically, what I'm curious about is in just about every class I teach, I mention this statement, which I think might be overstating it somewhat, and I trust you to please push back on it. But I think about the 2008 global financial crisis as the modern day equivalent in some ways to the May 4th movement, that it has that kind of an impact in that it essentially devalued the ways in which China saw kind of its aspirational trajectory, and provided a kind of maybe in some ways real, but in other ways maybe misinterpreted notion of the bankruptcy of the ways in which China found itself surrounded in terms of development models and things like that. I guess my question is, do you share that, or is that a little bit too much? And then the second part of that is, do you get the sense that that is, if that is the case, how much of that is driving China's behavior kind of writ large?
Well, these are great questions. I mean, I think I've thought a fair bit about this. I think that in 2008, 2009, when President Obama entered office, we were sort of navigating through the global financial crisis. And there was this perception in Beijing, I was living there at the time, that we don't need to have a teacher-student relationship with the United States anymore. Look at these guys, they're a mess. Why should we follow their lead or accept their recommendations for how to govern our economy or deal with our society? And part of the response, I think, from the United States was to think we can't allow ourselves to be seen as weakening or diminished. And so we're going to pivot to Asia, rebalance to Asia to demonstrate our continuing strength and resilience and sort of keep China aware of our overall strength. Now, fast forward to 2021. Biden administration enters office. There are these notions coming out of Beijing that the East is rising and the West is declining, that time and momentum are on China's side, and that you could sort of replay this analogy, right? What are we watching? We're watching the United States strengthen its position in Asia as a bulwark against perceptions of China being on the march. We're not talking about the rebalance anymore. Instead, we're talking about the Quad and the Australia, United Kingdom, United States agreement. Different words, same concept, right? We're replaying this cycle again. And the question I think that everyone has is this analogy going to continue to go forward? Because as the Obama administration sort of progressed in its terms, there was a desire, I think, to stabilize the relationship, to find ways where the United States and China can deal productively with each other, whether it's on climate or Ebola or on global financial recovery or other issues, because we simply recognized that we're the two largest actors in the international system. And this sort of gets to the virtual meeting this week. Is this the first indication that we are sort of traveling along that arc again and beginning to move back towards the direction of trying to find ways to have a more productive relationship, or not? And it's, it's too early to tell. It's a subject of debate. But I think that the Chinese feel like they've seen this movie before. The United States is going to respond strongly using the tools that are most readily available to it, military tools, to demonstrate its strength and remind China of American power. But as time goes by, China can afford to be patient. The United States will come back to them because there are things that the United States needs China's support for.
So that segues really nicely into an observation that I had, and I'd like to just talk a little bit about that, and that is when the reaction the United States gets from a lot of third-party countries, either allies or potential allies or fellow travelers, is that don't make us choose. Please don't make us choose. And I guess my question is, why is the U.S. so resistant to that sentiment? And is that something that we might be able to adapt to, or is that just a tension that we're going to have to just continually manage?
It's a good question. I don't know the answer to it. I think that my impressionistic sense, is that the intensity of concern around that question in other capitals in Asia and elsewhere has diminished somewhat over the past 10 months. When the U.S.-China relationship becomes increasingly confrontational, then there's a feeling that there's less space for countries to hedge in the middle. And when the level of tensions begins to lower, then there's a little bit more space for countries to find their footing and look for areas of opportunity to either work with the United States or China, depending upon their interest. My sense is that the impression in the region is that levels of tension in the U.S.-China relationship are moderating somewhat, which is creating more space for countries to find their footing. If tensions elevate again, which they may, then I think we may hear more of this "don't make us choose" stuff. But the challenge that I think that countries have, just to be really honest, because I think we're at SAIS, we should be intellectually rigorous about this, is that a lot of them are uncomfortable with some of China's behavior, but are unsure of how to handicap America's future political trajectory. 2024 is not that far away, And if they have lingering questions or doubts about where the United States is going to go in the future, they're going to be cautious and hedge to preserve as much optionality as they can to adjust to changing circumstances. And that's frustrating, I think, for American policymakers who want to say, look, we're friends, be with us, stand next to us. And that's not necessarily in their interest to do so.
I mean, that brings in the role of domestic politics in both of these. So riffing on one of the things that you were saying earlier about the observation that 48 out of 50 things that keep Xi Jinping awake at night are domestic. How are some of the ways in which our two countries play to different audiences, and where are they, in your view, what is particularly effective, and what are areas that seem to fall flat, and why?
Well, my first reaction is that hawks reinforce hawks in both countries, right? So when American hawks have the loudest microphones, it gives ample cause for Luo Yan and others to say, look, we're justified in our concerns because look at what they're saying, what they're doing. So there is a action-reaction dynamic, I think, to our politics. I think that there, in recent years, has been growing skepticism in Washington about the idea that there may be a diversity of views inside China. It's becoming increasingly accepted wisdom that there is this monolithic view and monolithic support for Xi Jinping and everything that Xi Jinping says and does, and that the country will march in lockstep whichever direction he points. I am less comfortable than most with that characterization. Having lived there and been around China for a while, it's a diverse, complicated, complex country where there are a lot of people who have very strong views about things. They may not always be evident or visible, but that doesn't mean that they're absent. And so that's one thing that I think about. The other thing, just to think about it on the U.S. side for a second, I also think that we owe ourselves a bit of due diligence on the question of whether or not there is a hardened bipartisan consensus as it relates to China. Because my sense is that there is at a very superficial level, but that hardened bipartisan consensus sort of erodes the deeper that you get. Because, is China a threat? Are they a challenge? Are they our principal competitor? A lot of people would say yes. What is our objective with China? Is it to undermine the Chinese Communist Party? Is it to slow their rate of growth? Is it to put ourselves in a stronger position to outcompete them? You'd get a variance of answers on that question. How much risks should the United States take in its challenging China? How much costs should, my uncle in Des Moines, Iowa, be willing to pay for our competition with China? I think you get a very broad set of answers to that question. So I would just say that we both have our own pathologies in our politics, and they can play in unhealthy ways back and forth.
So I want to open up the floor in just a moment. I just have two more questions, if you'll and you will all indulge me and us. The first is I joined very much at the tail end of kind of the initial phase, but of a project where a number of U.S. scholars of China or US-China relations engaged with their Chinese counterparts on US-China relations. And one of the things that we were trying to think about were areas of kind of natural cooperation or potential cooperation. And one of the areas that was discussed and analyzed was in non-traditional security. And one of the things that I drew from those papers, those meetings, and those discussions, remember this was maybe my first 2 years at SAIS, so 2018, 2019, that one of the areas that just seemed like an obvious node for cooperation was in pandemic response. And then COVID hit, and we saw, I think, both countries make some really unfortunate initial missteps. But the problem there seemed to have been that not the initial missteps, because of course it's a crisis. Initial missteps are inevitable. But the doubling down on both sides was something that I think was far more problematic, both in terms of dealing with the immediate crisis, but then also in terms of kind of steps ahead. And I'm just wondering, do you have anything reassuring that I might be able to take home with me?
Well, I think that the missteps that you're describing were a symptom of a broader dysfunction in the U.S.-China relationship. The connectivity that had been established between both countries had frayed in the years preceding the outbreak of COVID-19. And we just saw that in very practical ways with the reduction in the CDC staff from the United States resident in our embassy and consulates in China, for example. It would have been really helpful to have our experts on the front lines, on the ground, being able to work alongside their Chinese counterparts to understand what was happening in real time and be able to formulate responses to it in real time. Instead, they were withdrawn from China. They were back in the United States, and that was unfortunate. In the previous administration that I served in, there was a very deliberate effort to put CDC experts and other public health experts on the ground, on the front lines, for this very type of occasion. And it's a sort of a tragedy that they were not there when they were needed most. But I don't want to end on a down note. I'm an optimist by nature, so let me just say this. I'm not sure that we will be able to bridge our differences and find a way to partner together on the response to COVID-19, even though I think that is the shortest, quickest path for the United States and China to both get themselves out of the circumstances that we're in. But I do think that it is in our national interest and in China's national interest to find ways to build a public health surveillance architecture around the world so that we can both rapidly detect viruses when they emerge and not have to wait for them to metastasize to recognize where they're coming from. And the reality is that the United States and China are uniquely capable in this regard in ways that no other country in the world is. So if it's in both of our interests, if we both have unique capabilities, hopefully over time our national interest will just guide us in the direction of doing what serves our own interest, which will push us in a common direction.
And I think building into that architecture, not simply the technical dimensions needed for kind of the substantive area, but also some sort of political safeguard or safeguards against kind of political manipulation, or if there's some sort, and that I don't know how one would kind of craft that better mousetrap, but that would be
I think the more that we have these issues managed by technocrats and not by people with political pressures, the more insulation that we'll have against sort of the political winds of the moment. And so, I hope that empowered experts and technocrats can really sort of grab the reins of some of these issues and just work them on a continuous basis.
Amen. One last question, just because I can't resist. So on pages 176 to 177, you have this fascinating anecdote where you're sitting next to Li Jiangshu at dinner. And he talks about the differences in China's preparation for meetings with Russia versus meetings with the United States. If I could just ask you to summarize that, but there's a question at the end, which is, which one would we prefer?
Well, it's a good question. So Li Jiangshu is this enigmatic figure, this person that always sat next to Xi Jinping in meetings with President Obama but never spoke. He would, in breaks between meetings, and we would all go to coffee, he would tuck away. He was this unreachable, inaccessible figure. And so I found myself at the state dinner for Xi Jinping at the White House, sitting at this table, which was great. I was just happy to be there. And then Li Jiangshu moves the placard in the seat next to me and puts his down. I thought, wow, this is fantastic. I'll have 2.5 hours with Li Jiangshu. This is great. The reason why he did that, and I don't want to go into this all in the book, but the reason why he did that was he wanted to be in line of sight with President Xi, so that he could be responsive to any signal that President Xi provided. And it sort of speaks to the nature of the relationship in ways that I took lessons from. But he was relatively guarded in the course of the dinner conversation. But he did, to Professor Mertha's question, he did allow himself to get drawn out a little bit on making a contrast between how they prepare for meetings with Russia's president and how they do with America's president. And the basic gist of it was that going to Moscow or meeting with Russian officials is like meeting with friends. It's comfortable. You don't have to be too stressed out about it. You can just sort of be yourself and talk about what you feel, and they can talk about what they feel. Whereas coming to Washington is like preparing for an exam. You have to have everything down. You have to have studied and absorbed and really understood the talking points and the logic behind them, because it was high stakes and it was not, necessarily a friendly exchange. Which one would I prefer? As someone who's been in the room for those meetings, I think that the Russians probably have more fun with it than we do. But look, when American and Chinese leaders meet, it is the big leagues. It's unlike any other meeting between leaders, and I've been in meetings that we've had with other leaders. It's just fundamentally different because the stakes are so high. And it creates a unique dynamic where both sides bring their best game to the show.
Thank you so much. So why don't we've got if we only have one microphone to use, let's use this one. Ellie, could I trouble you to...
And let me just say, I welcome questions, but I also welcome comments. I want this to be a discussion. I want to hear from you and listen to you and learn from you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Haas. It's a terrific book to read and very well articulated, and it's just refreshing to our mind after reading so many rigorous academic books. So thank you for that, and I really enjoy this conversation. I have one little questions about. So you kind of mentioned the key. Oh, sorry. So I am Gloria. I'm not really affiliated with SAIS. I am a Cornell Gov PhD candidate, but I do research here for this year. So my question is regarding, so you kind of emphasize that it is really key to have the confidence when dealing with China, and even, acknowledging that they are performing well. So my question is, I think the perception of performing well is very different from both sides. And especially, I think, because of the two political system, one is more transparent than the other. So I think in some cases it's easier, to see the problems in the United States versus it's really hard. And it's all based on propaganda, right? So it's really hard for the general audience sometimes to see the problem on one side, while it's so easy to see I don't want to say the mess, but in a democratic system. So I'm just wondering, given this asymmetry, and also I think both sides have very different standard on this defining how performing well, right? Governance performance. They have different emphasis, some on human rights, on liberty, and one side more on overall economic performance. So I'm just wondering, I think this is really perplexing me a lot. How do you view these asymmetry? And especially, I think, even in the meeting, it's not just the audience in China and the States. We have a global audience regarding who is performing better. So I just want to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, Gloria, thank you for your question. I very much agree with your observation about the asymmetry and how it makes it easier, I think, for China to present the narrative that they want than it does for American leaders to articulate the narrative that we want. I should just caveat slightly that I do think that China has performed well on a lot of metrics. As an American, I'm not comfortable with how they've performed on human rights metrics. And I think we should just be honest and candid about that. When I was the embassy reporting officer for Xinjiang, I had a chance to travel to Xinjiang every quarter and spend time there and get to know people there. And it breaks my heart to see what has happened in the years since I was last there. On the broader question, we've always had an asymmetry with closed authoritarian states that control their own media versus ours. And we had similar conversations in the early years of the Cold War, where it seemed like the Soviet Union was doing so well, we were struggling so much. And I think that we just have to sort of ask ourselves if we really do believe what we say, that our governance system and the messiness embedded in it creates, over time, quality outcomes. And I think that we need to have confidence that, Google was founded by a few 20-somethings. Microsoft was created in a garage. Amazon was launched in a house a few blocks away from my grandmother's in Kirkland, Washington. And now it's a global company. There's something about the way our country works that allows these things to happen. And there's just, an element that gives us a lot of reason for having confidence in ourselves. At the same time, we have social inequality issues. We have racial issues. I think part of our strength is that we're able to talk about them and that we can be open about them. And it puts pressure on our leaders to address them and to improve upon them in ways that may not be the same inside China's system. And so I guess the way that I think about it is that we should use some of our messiness as a strength. To really have that self-critical eye on what it is that we need to improve upon, and hopefully our system will force us to make progress on those issues.
I have a question. So it's quite connected to Gloria's question on performance. My name is Hasta Coleman. I'm a PhD student here at SAIS in China Studies. So my question is, and I also work for the China Center, it's really about what you said earlier regarding promoting different systems. Of course, in the U.S., we've had a long history of democracy promotion, and like around the world, and trying to support new democracies and trying to encourage democratic transition. And even recently, Biden has been talking about aligning with like-minded nations, kind of in that sort of same vein. I don't see this coming from Beijing. Beijing's not like promoting authoritarian systems or one-party states. They're selling surveillance technology to authoritarian states. But to me, there's like a fundamental difference there in the kind of self-promotion or the promotion of a certain type of set of values that happens. And I was just wondering if you could speak more to that and how you see the Chinese side in that equation.
Yeah, these are, as I would expect, really hard questions. I guess I have a few thoughts, and I hope, I'm happy to hand the microphone to you at any point here, but I hope others will jump in on this question too, because it's important. There is a concern, I think, that many people in policy circles in the United States have, that the way that a country behaves at home is a leading indicator of how they will project their power abroad once they have the capacity to do so. And seen through that light, I think that many people grow concerned about what they're watching in terms of overall trend lines inside China as leading indicators of how they would like to see the international system develop as they gain greater power and influence in the international system. So I think that the concern that many people have is not necessarily that we are in this universalistic struggle to promote dueling governance systems, but just that as China gains greater capacity, countries will choose to emulate aspects of China's domestic governance system in ways that are discomforting to America's efforts to advance, what we consider to be universal values. And that's, I think, at the heart of the concern that many people have. As for myself, I guess I'm less concerned than others on this score. I don't see a lot of countries clamoring to be like China. I think that there are countries that are, and leaders of countries who see certain things, like, well, if I can suppress dissent online and, reduce criticism of me, that's not a bad thing. That sounds pretty good, right? And are willing to sort of embrace certain aspects of China's governance model in ways that legitimize China's conduct at home, which, we are uncomfortable with. But I still think that the offering that we have is pretty compelling. And the way to make it more compelling is to improve our own performance, because that is what will put the most stress upon the types of behaviors that we're uncomfortable with, is when we can show that we have a better alternative to offer for the challenges that both of our societies confront.
Do you mind? I just wanted to add one thing, and I don't want to monopolize this, but I wanted to hit one other aspect of it. And Hosta, I think you and others have heard at least parts of this anecdote. I've said it enough times that you'd think I'd remember the person's name. but a couple Olympics ago, there was a Chinese swimmer, a female swimmer, who was interviewed of course, they interview them as soon as they come out of the pool, and she had come in fourth, and so the people that were interviewing her, she was telling them that this is. I mean, she was just very kind of goofy and just not at all kind of poised, and she said, well, I didn't do as well as I would have liked to, but maybe next time, and it was just I've done better in other races, the past couple of days. This one didn't go so well. What are you going to do? And while she's talking to them, they said, no, you came in third. And then she said, I came in third, and just this whole kind of, and I was thinking, if Beijing would just stop trying to stifle and control the narrative, if it was full of people like that swimmer, China would eat our lunch on the propaganda front. But I think, in all seriousness, I think there's an elegance that Xi Jinping, particularly, I think it's one of the themes that comes out of the resolution on party history this week, that of trying to find things kind of in history kind of dovetailing towards this kind of elegance that can be controlled. And I think there's also a strength, and I think a greater strength potentially. I don't want to sound jingoistic, but in the mess that we have. So if the choice is either something, or it seems to be anyway, something that is elegant and top down, or essentially showing the whole world the way the sausage is made, there seems to, and I don't know why, but there seems to be something more compelling about the latter than the former. And whoever knows the answer as to why, I think there's a dissertation right there. But anyway,
Hi, my name is Anita Kellogg. I'm a postdoctorate fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute here at SAIS. And I actually want to go back to what you were saying in the very beginning about complex or competitive interdependence. My dissertation was on economic interdependence and military conflict in respect to China. So there are three pillars to the Kantian peace, right? So it's democracy, trade, and international organizations. And when I've asked colleagues and stuff, why is China revisionist? They often say, well, they're competing on placing their own international organization institutions in place. Even more so, though, we see that they are taking up the leadership in many of the organizations the U.S. started, because the U.S., even before Trump, had started to withdraw from them. And so it seems to me that that's a huge problem if we're going to say, oh, we're actually going to try to use our strengths to compete. And sort of, yeah, so what are your thoughts on that? Will we ever really take advantage of that? Or the hostility that we have generated in our own public, right? And so somewhat what Dr. Mertha was saying about our messiness, but part of it is also the problem that we have sold China as a zero-sum game. And I know very thoughtful, intellectual people who are convinced that if China gains anything, the U.S. loses. And there's even the suggestion that we should not have let them in the trading regime, period, something that led, millions, hundreds of millions out of poverty because we have turned them into a competitor of the U.S. So there's so much of this thinking and how it's almost so much like you can't have just an intellectual leaders like this is what we should do if you have created an entire public that thinks of it in that way.
Well, it's a very keen observation. I'm not sure what the question is in that, but I guess I'll just put a few thoughts on the table, and maybe Professor Mertha can reinforce me here. On the earlier conversation we were having, I think that people naturally have a skepticism of airbrushed perfection. I think it's just human nature. And there's no airbrush perfection in anyone who's looking at the United States today, right? It's messy, it's real, it's raw, it's underperforming, but it's authentic. And you know, this whole effort around party history, controlling the past in order to dictate the future, I think that a lot of people are aware of China's history. Not all of it's perfect, and presenting it as perfect, it may work for certain domestic purposes, but I don't know if it's going to have a lot of purchase abroad or overseas. And we should keep that in mind. On a few of the points that you were putting on the table, first off, I don't think that China is creating any alternate international architecture. I think they're hedging. The same time that they're creating the BRICS Bank, they're increasing their investments in the IMF. The same time that they're pushing forward the BRI, they're increasing their voting shares in the World Bank. There's not a lot of evidence that they're withdrawing from one in order to put all their eggs in the other. They're investing in both simultaneously as a hedging process. So that's the first thought. The second thought, I think that that public opinion in the United States may be more malleable than your characterization would suggest. I also don't know that China is a dominant aspect of many Americans' voting patterns. When Americans are asked to prioritize what it is that most animates their decisions on votes, help me find an example of China being at the top. I can't find one. It's usually 7th, 8th, 9th in the priority of issues. So China is an easy area for people to sort of feel frustrated. It's an easy vehicle for people's expressions of disappointment or anger or frustration about the inability of our political system to solve their problems. But it's not something that I consider to be a feature of reordering political society in the United States. So I would just sort of add an asterisk to the, I think, the deliberately provocative framing that you provided. I would also say that a lot of times, you know, the views of leaders influence the nature of discourse in the United States on China issues, right? So when everyone is talking about great power competition, that's a safe place for people to be, people like me, to, let's talk about great power competition. When people are talking about competitive coexistence, it's safer to talk about competitive coexistence. And so there's a certain pendulum swinging that takes place, I think, in the American political system. I don't think it's sort of a unidirectional runaway train that can't be stopped, which I think some people may think in this current moment. As I look back on the history of US-China relations, it's a history of zigs and zags, right? From estrangement during the early Cold War years to cautious opening during the wake of the Cultural Revolution, from optimism at the start of reform and opening to deep disappointment after Tiananmen, from deepening social and economic bonds 10 years ago to talk of decoupling today. Like, we've had a lot of zigs and zags, and we just need to keep that in mind, I think, to preserve a little bit of intellectual modesty about forecasting where we're going based upon some picture of the president. Yeah, please. Right. And the United States has since re-entered the WHO and since retaken a more prominent position on climate issues, and then I think has had a diminishing effect on perceptions of China's leadership in both of those issue areas. No, I very much accept your point. I'm not trying to challenge it. I just wanted to try to put those other issues on the table as well.
Hi, I'm Bowen, second year SAIS and May student. First of all, thanks for a great presentation. I think it's very insightful. I've got a question on the AUKUS deal. I mean, we have seen Australia as determined to prioritize its relationship with the United States and Great Britain by violating the rule-based order to some extent. If the rules of such order is flexible, why the United States and its allies ask China to rigidly follow? I mean, in other words, it's still important for United States to maintain the rules-based order at such circumstances. I mean, giving the leeway to others is also giving it to its own. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks for your comment. To be honest, I used to serve in government, and I used to write about the rules-based order in all of our talking points. I really don't know what that means, like in really, really serious practical terms. It's sort of, I can say that now, right? Yeah. But what I think that we really care about is preserving access to Asia. I think what we really care about is preserving open and free waterways and airspace. I think what we really care about is sort of our view that that disputes should be resolved peacefully without coercion or violence. And those are, I think, the sort of the underlying interests or objectives that are animating some of these actions that I think you were pointing to. And we are becoming increasingly concerned about our ability to continue to protect those interests. And that's being reflected by our willingness to take actions that maybe 5, 10, 20 years ago we would be less open to taking.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hess and Professor Mertha, for hosting this. My name is Valentina. I'm also from Cornell. I am currently a senior in undergrad, and I don't study international relations, so I apologize. This is just a very simple question. But when you were mentioning about alliance and the strategy of the U.S. Playing our own strength to compete, I'm just curious. I've been kind of starting to hear this narrative since the Biden administration, but I'm wondering, why is it a challenge for domestic politicians to adopt to this strategy? And it's interesting, in one of the response to the questions you mentioned that China is not on the top of the American voters' mind. So I'm just curious, maybe how, if this is the strategy going forward, how would the politicians sell this strategy to the everyday Americans? And it's interesting also, your book is, the intended audience is like the general American public. So I'm just curious. Thanks.
Well, maybe I can offer two thoughts. The first is that I think that the Biden team genuinely, authentically believes that America's alliance network and its partnerships that it's cultivated over the course of decades around the world are a competitive advantage for the United States. So I think that it's a real belief, a real view amongst that team. And I agree with it. I support them on that. But I also think that there is an element of this high-profile emphasis on it that is intended to differentiate the Biden administration's approach from the previous administration's approach. The critique of the previous administration is that it was impulsive and unilateral in its approach to China, and that the Biden administration will be deliberate, methodical, thoughtful, and working in close partnership with allies and partners, so that the contrast is very, very clear. The second thought is that there is a strand of thinking. I don't associate it with the Biden administration per se, but there are voices in Washington who feel very strongly that we need to really help raise public awareness of the threat that China poses to America in order to mobilize the American public and unify American views so that we can overcome domestic political divisions and really sort of rise to our potential to meet the threat that China poses to us. And just as America was able to overcome totalitarianism and communism in the 20th century, this is what we need to do in order to overcome authoritarianism in the 21st century. So there's this view, it's most prominent, I think, among grand strategists, that we wouldn't have really dealt with some of our racial tensions in the 50s and 60s in the United States unless we had the Soviet Union to galvanize us to overcome those divisions, to deal with our domestic problems, and that maybe, just maybe, if we inflate the China challenge large enough, that it will have a similar effect on domestic discourse in the United States.
Maybe 2 or 3 questions together, so that just so we can get to everybody.
Thank you very much. My name is Steven. I'm currently first year MA at SAIS. But before that, I work in the Taiwanese Legislative Yuan for my boss, who is in the National Defense and Foreign Affairs Committee. I was wondering, in your opening remarks, you talked about that the US and China is not necessary for them to, per se, win or lose, but to compete on who has the best solution. But what came to my mind, first of all, is how about Taiwan? So recalling your excellent comments and answers in the previous Brookings session that you made about Biden and Xi, you said that the two countries have decades of experiences in managing the Taiwan issue. So I was wondering, can you perhaps elaborate more on your excellent questions? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Haas, for coming. I look forward to reading your book after finals. I'm Beth. I'm a second-year China Studies MA student here, and I am curious about your thoughts on the common prosperity push and how that'll affect the U.S.-China relationship, whether we can cooperate on reducing income inequalities in our two countries, or whether it'll be like something that the U.S. can use to emphasize that in our politics, or whether it'll just lead to more competition. Thanks.
Thanks. I'm Madeline, until recently involved with all things China here at SAIS. And just very quickly, the Taiwan question, I was wondering about Hong Kong and how you would put your framework into practice or advise the Biden administration to deal with the Hong Kong question, especially in light of the fact that next year is the 25th anniversary of the Hong Kong Agreement, so it's going to be in the news. You know, how do we show with confidence and work with our allies on this vexing issue?
Thank you for these questions. I'll be mindful of time and try to be deliberately brief in my comments. On Taiwan, I don't see much middle ground between the United States and China. We just have differences of views, differences of interests that are pretty irreconcilable. At the same time, both countries have found it to be in their interest for the past 40-plus years to create a diplomatic framework for managing their disagreements so that we don't have to use military tools to register our views. I think that it remains in both countries' interests, not out of goodwill or amity, but just out of pure, naked self-interest to keep these problems within an existing diplomatic framework. And so my expectation is that each of our own interests will guide us back in that direction to work within sort of a commonly accepted, if not commonly appreciated, set of bounds for how we deal with Taiwan issues. I'm pretty confident that President Tsai is moderate, stable, not looking for a crisis. I'm pretty confident that President Biden doesn't see a lot of profit from allowing the situation in the Taiwan Strait to escalate to the point of conflict. So I think that that on that side of the equation, there's a pretty high degree of predictability. I can have less confidence in my ability to forecast how leaders in Beijing will approach the Taiwan question. But I continue to believe that they have their own incentives to want to try to create conditions over time that will allow them to achieve their political objectives without use of force if it remains possible to do so. And so that's, I guess, how I've been thinking about the Taiwan issue. The Hong Kong issue is a really hard one. I wish I had a better answer. I've been asked about this a lot in the last several months, and I'm still trying to come up with something that I can say that will seem constructive. I don't think that all hope is lost in Hong Kong. I think that there are still unique attributes to Hong Kong that deserve to be protected and prioritized by the United States. And I think that it's fundamentally in our interest and the interest of the United Kingdom and others to keep shining a spotlight on Hong Kong. I think that Beijing would prefer for the focus to shift elsewhere, for Hong Kong to become more deeply integrated into the mainland and to, over time, become another Chinese city. And I was heartened, for example, that the G7 foreign ministers decided to establish a working group to keep a constant focus on Hong Kong and keep that discussion going. I think that these types of things are healthy, and they hopefully will induce a bit of sobriety and caution in how Beijing decides to proceed from here. On the issue of common prosperity, I think that it's a complicated story. I'm sort of skeptical of single source explanations for what's going on. I think that there are a lot of things that are happening inside China's domestic political system. One of which is the fact that they really are struggling to have a redistributive policy in place. Social inequalities are widening. There's discomfort with sort of the emergence of a powerful oligarchic class. I think that there's also frustration with the idea that capital and talent can be dedicated to improving food delivery service times, but not sort of core competencies that the Chinese leadership has identified. And I also think that President Xi wants to differentiate Chinese socialism from American capitalism, and he wants to sort of make progress where Mao and Deng didn't. Both Mao and Deng spoke about common prosperity. They each had their own definition for it. They each came up short of meeting their own definition, and I think that Xi would like to show that he is capable of sort of making progress on an issue that two of the other big names in Chinese politics failed to do so.
So why don't we do this? Instead of holding everybody hostage, why don't we, any remaining questions, why don't you just, as soon as we conclude, just come on up and we'll be happy to discuss them there. Just a couple closing words, if I could. You can really measure the level of engagement and the excellence of a talk, not by how many people are in the audience, but subtracting the number of people at the end of the talk from the original number at the beginning. And I think the number is either 0 or close to it, which I think is high praise indeed. Thank you so very much for the time that you've taken, and thank you all for being here.